Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus, and thanks for joining us for our webinar Wednesdays. We host a webinar every Wednesday throughout the entire year 2018. The webinars are all complimentary, and we bring in industry experts, accountants, attorneys, and other government contracting professionals. The full list of our upcoming webinars can be found on our website under the webinar section, and just below that you can find all of the archived webinars with a link to the recording. Again, today's session is complimentary and it is being recorded, so thanks for joining us. A little bit about us. We are based in downtown Washington, D.C. and provide various professional services for both product and service companies that are selling to the federal government. This ranges from market analysis reports, GSA schedule assistance, 8A certification, proposal writing, and more. We do host networking events and seminars throughout the year, so you can find those on our website under the events section. Our next event is Monday, March 26th over at the Kennedy Center. We have confirmed attendance from the Air Force and GSA. Again, you can sign up for that event on our website under the events section. Without further ado, we are going to talk today about getting the contracting officer to yes. Our speaker is Krzysztof Młynarczyk, and I will hand the floor over to him. So this slide, you can see his background, and we'll dig into the presentation. So we've got the first slide up, a day in the life of a contracting officer. Thanks for joining us, Krzysztof.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I'm Krzysztof Młynarczyk. I own Krzysztof LLC, and I offer consulting, expert witness services, and I also professionally teach government contract law, the FAR, bid protests, and all sorts of things like that. How I got into this is that I'm a former contracting officer. I also served a brief rotation as a JAG acquisitions attorney for the Air Force. So this subject is near and dear to my heart. As somebody who used to be a federal contracting officer, I have experience in that chair, so I'm going to share with you the same advice that I give to my consulting clients on how to deal with the contracting officer, how to negotiate with the contracting officer, how to persuade the contracting officer, and I'm also going to give you tips on what not to do when you're speaking with or communicating with the contracting officer, because there certainly are some ways that you can make them upset or make them think that you're not as professional and as prepared as the other contractors. And you never want that, because the contracting officer is one of your most important clients. So, a day in the life of a contracting officer. Now remember, you're a federal employee, you have a special warrant or authority, you are available to award contracts and administer or modify contracts on behalf of the United States government and on behalf of the agency that you're working with, like GSA or the Department of Defense or the National Park Service. Now, the first thing you need to understand about a day in the life of a contracting officer is that they are stuck with deadlines every day. You have to understand that you are not the only customer for that contracting officer. And in fact, you're likely going to be calling about your existing contract, right? You'll be asking about a modification, maybe a request for equitable adjustment, maybe a claim under the Contracts Disputes Act. So you have to understand that overwhelmingly, contracting officers are responsible for awarding new contracts. They have a strong incentive to award new contracts, to obligate the existing money that has been appropriated to them by Congress by the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. So when you call them about your existing contract and modifying your existing contract, they almost view it as extra work, because the deadlines they're most concerned about are getting the new contracts out the door. If you think about it, this is exactly why we have the COR, the COR, the Contracting Officer Representative. Contracting officers are busy awarding new contracts left and right, and they couldn't possibly have the time to administer and modify every single contract that they've awarded over the course of their career. So they delegate some of this work to the contracting officer representative. Now, as far as the workload, you have to remember that contracting officers have a very large amount of workload at all times. One of the reasons for this is the changing nature of the profession of contracting. If you take a history lesson, back in the 1990s, there was a significant acquisition reform, which got rid of a lot of the administrative positions that were involved in acquisition and contracting. Now, this administrative work that was performed by these administrative professionals did not go away. They just eliminated the positions. Now take a wild guess. Who had to pick up the slack? Well, that's right. Contracting officers had to absorb a lot of that administrative work, which keeps them very busy. There's a lot of data entry requirements. As you know, they have to enter data into FPDS. They have to enter data into FBO.gov and a number of other databases. There also might be additional internal tracking requirements at their agency. So what all that translates into is you have to be very respectful of the contracting officer's time. You have to understand that they're under great and pressing deadlines all the time. They have a huge amount of workload, and that you are not the only one on their plate. So along those lines, if we go to the next slide, how to impress the contracting officer. First and foremost, to impress the contracting officer, you want to be prepared. You want to know what you're talking about. Just doing that alone, I can tell you in my experience, will make you better and more respected than 90% of the contractors that contact the contracting officer. When I was a contracting officer, I got many, many phone calls from unprepared contractors or contractors who had not done their homework. And believe me, that does not put you off on a good foot with one of your most important clients, the contracting officer. So here's one of your first tips for what not to do. Do not just pick up the phone the first time you think you need to do something or ask something of a contracting officer. Do not just immediately call them before you've formed your thoughts, before you've done your research, and before you know what you're talking about. Make sure you have detailed notes in front of you before you even pick up the phone to call them. Make sure you've done the research. If there's a clause in your contract that you're asking about, have you actually researched that clause? Have you read the relevant literature? Have you seen if it's the subject of GAO, Government Accountability Office protests, or maybe protests at the Court of Federal Claims? You need to make sure you do that research, because you will definitely not be impressing the contracting officer unless you know what you're talking about and it shows that you've done your due diligence. So that's one of the things that Christoph LLC helps clients out with, is performing that research and making sure that you are prepared to talk to the contracting officer. Another thing you should have detailed notes, but you should also have an agenda. Even if it's a phone call, you should have a solid agenda of what am I going to say, what am I going to ask, and then what is the path forward? What is the recommendation? What do I want to happen? Because what you don't want to do is just ask the contracting officer, well, what do you think we should do? That's not going to impress the contracting officer. Just like when you're dealing with a busy executive, just like when you're dealing with your boss or anyone else, you want to have a recommendation. You want to present them with solutions, not more problems. So always have a path forward, always have a final ask or request with a proposed solution. If we go to the next slide, this is a delicate situation. Contracting officers are not always correct. They're human, just like all of us, right? So how you handle that is absolutely important for the success of your relationship with the government and with your client, whether it's the program manager, the contracting officer representative, or the contracting officer. Now, of course, you have to exercise diplomacy when you do this. Always be respectful, always be courteous. The last thing you should ever do is get in some sort of a shouting match or insult the contracting officer. That would be a very poor idea. But what I would encourage you to do is to choose your battles. I think you should exercise judgment on which topics you will quibble with or disagree with your contracting officer about. You have to pay attention to things that will hurt your business's bottom line. So if it's an accounting problem, if it's a reimbursement or a payment issue, yes, that is worth fighting that battle. If it's a very smaller issue that involves a very small amount of administrative work on your part and you think you can live with that and it will not affect your profitability, then maybe that's something that you want to let slide. In other words, choose your battles carefully and remember that you only have a certain amount of political capital to spend, and spend it wisely. Now, let's talk about some common mistakes by the contracting officer, because they're not always correct. One of the ones that I want to leave you with in this presentation is about updating your FAR clauses during an option exercise. This is a mistake. This is wrong. But a lot of contracting officers are unfortunately trying to do this. Now, if you have a 5-year contract, let's say the end of the first base year is complete, and the government is exercising the second year of the contract, the first option year. Some contracting officers will try to execute a mod that exercises the option, but also updates all of your existing FAR clauses or adds new FAR clauses that were not in the contract before. And they'll say, oh, well, now that we're exercising your option, we thought we would just update the clauses because there's new versions out there and we want to be compliant. I'm telling you right now that is incorrect. That is not how things work. You should push back on something like that, and here's why. The contract you signed a year ago is the contract that you are subject to. That contract had specific clauses with specific dates in it. That's why after a FAR clause, you see a parentheses and maybe August 2016 or March 2015. That's the version of the FAR clause that you are subject to, and these FAR clauses do change over time. Now, the reason they can't just shove that down your throat is because you signed a specific deal, and that deal includes those clauses and those versions of those clauses, and that deal applies to all of the years of the contract. An option is a unilateral right of the government to exercise, but they do not have the unilateral right to change the contract during option exercise, which is what they would be trying to do if they want to change those FAR clauses during the option exercise. So when they do that, they're going to try to change your clauses around without you charging them any more money or anything else in consideration, and that would be a mistake on your part. You need to clearly explain to the contracting officer what I just went over, that you're subject to the clauses at the time of signature, and that any new clauses or any changes to existing clauses that will cost you time, money, or resources, well, you need to be compensated for that, because that is a fundamental change to the contract, to its terms and conditions, and that costs you money, and the government would be obligated to pay you for that. So don't fall for that. Now, let's move to the next slide, how to persuade the contracting officer. Now, I've written many articles on this theme. This is a very common theme in many of the articles I write and many of the speeches that I give on government contracts, the sources of authority. In other words, what are the citations and the references that a contracting professional can rely upon? You need to be familiar with these. And if you work in the government contracting profession, you need to understand statutes, regulations, court decisions, and policy. That's the language of the contracting officer, and that is what will persuade a contracting officer to your position. If you want to advance a position and you want something to happen, you need to rely on these 4 sources of authority. So let's go over them very briefly. A statute is passed by Congress, such as the National Defense Authorization Act or the Small Business Act, right? But those statutes are where it starts. The statutes are then implemented into regulations by federal agencies, and that's where we hit the FAR, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. and then the DFARS, or all the other agency supplements to the FAR. Those are all regulations. They're found in Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. They're all there under the FAR, but another one I want to draw your attention to. Everybody neglects the small business regulations promulgated by the Small Business Administration, the SBA. Those are found in Title 13 of the Code of Federal Regulations. You will not find all of those in the FAR. The other source of authority would be court decisions. You know, GAO, or Court of Federal Claims, or Boards of Contract Appeals, court or quasi-judicial decisions for bid protests or claims under the Contract Disputes Act. Now, the fourth source of authority would be policy. Policy is a bit of a wild card because it's not a statute passed by Congress. It's not a regulation by an agency. It's not a court decision. It's something else. It's an internal agency written policy, and it has the most flexibility for the agency. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to keep track of this source of authority because they don't always do a good job of posting this information in a public place for you to find the policy. So these four sources of authority are what will persuade a contracting officer. I encourage you to at least understand what they are and be familiar with how they work. And the hierarchy would be that a statute should always trump a regulation, and a regulation should always trump a policy. They should be moving down in terms of specificity, in that a statute would be broad, a regulation would be more narrow and specific, and then an agency policy would be even more specific because it's showing how to execute that particular regulation, which is showing how to execute or implement that particular statute. Now, I have a fifth source of authority, and this is the most important, the contract itself. Don't ever forget that the contract is paramount. And here's another tip to avoid. Do not bring up the FAR if it's not in your contract. Also, don't allow the contracting officer to bring up the FAR if it's not in your contract. This might sound strange and controversial when I say this, but I published an article with this title in the National Contract Management Association's journal. The article is called "No, the FAR Does Not Apply to Contractors." Now, I know everybody just fell out of your chair when I said that, but that's actually true. The FAR does not apply to contractors. The FAR is guidance that applies to the contracting officer, and it tells them what FAR clauses to include in government contracts. So the only thing you care about is the FAR clauses which are in your contract or incorporated by reference into your contract. In other words, if someone brings up a FAR clause and you don't see it in your contract, that needs to be your first objection. Why are you bringing up a clause that I'm not subject to? I don't see that in my contract. Or if the contracting officer brings up FAR Part 8 or something, and you know that you've been dealing with simplified acquisitions in FAR Part 13, well, that's not relevant to you. That's guidance that applies to the contracting officer and how they do business for the federal government, not you. You're subject to the terms and conditions of your contract. Always remember that. So if I move to the next slide, the process. Now, this is the process that Christoph LLC goes through and Jennifer Schaus and Associates goes through when we want to do an initial consultation with a client to help them out with dealing with their government client. And this is something that you should go through internally with your company, even if you don't hire Christoph LLC or Jennifer Schaus and Associates to help you out with your matter. You should generally start off with the initial issue, which the consultation would handle, and then you want to make sure you do your research, find out what you're talking about, chase down every loose end. Then you're going to want to draft an outline or an agenda if you're going to have a phone call or an in-person meeting with the government. You want it to be orderly. You want to hit every point that you want it to. The next step would be the first contact, and that would be with the contracting officer, maybe with the Corps, and then things that you can explore. Don't ever forget, you can always elevate it. There are other options. If the contracting officer says no, there are other options. You can maybe go a level above the contracting officer. If it's serious enough, maybe you can file a claim under the Contract Disputes Act, or maybe you can file a request for equitable adjustment. But these types of judgment call issues are things that Christoph LLC and Jennifer Schaus and Associates help clients out with all the time. So moving to the next slide and last slide that I'm going to cover, a fundamental question for anybody listening to this or in the government contracts profession. Do you understand your contract? Have you actually read the entire contract? One of the favorite questions of a contracting officer is, did you read the contract? I asked contractors all the time when I was a contracting officer, did you read the contract? And often the answer was, no, I didn't read it all. That's a mistake. If you didn't read your contract or you didn't pay a professional like Christoph LLC to go over your contract and explain it to you, you are in a big problem. You need to understand it. You need to understand the FAR clauses. You need to understand the statement of work and what that entails. And this is one of the reasons people hire Christoph LLC to do an executive review of their contract and give them the bottom line. What are the payment clauses? What do they mean for me? When can I invoice? How do I invoice? What is the ordering clause if I'm under an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract? Am I subject to commercial or non-commercial government contract clauses? Can I be terminated for default, or will I instead be terminated for cause? What are my rights to submit claims under the Contract Disputes Act? How do we negotiate modifications under this contract? These are all critically important questions for your contract, and you want to know these immediately, which is why you should always have an executive summary of what's going on with each one of your contracts. Because when you have a problem, you'll be prepared rather than being scrambling around to handle it as if it's like an emergency that you didn't foresee. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer Schaus. And that concludes my presentation on getting to yes with the contracting officer. This is Christoph Minarchik from ChristophLLC.com. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Christoph. Great information as always, and certainly appreciate your insight and knowledge into the government contracting space. Christoph's contact information is here on this last slide, so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to him directly. He's got a wealth of knowledge, as you can see from this webinar. And next week on Wednesday, we are covering contract compliance. You can sign up for the webinar. Again, they are all complimentary, and they're listed on our website under the webinar section. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks again, Christoph.